My name is Austin Williams. Thank you very much for everyone for coming. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project, and welcome to the Bookshop Barnies with Reinier de Graaf discussing this book. You can see it clearly, Architecture Against Architecture, a manifesto. Reinier is speaking to us from Rotterdam, 1 hour ahead. The Dutch are always ahead of us. And details of the book are in the chat function. And also, if you feel inclined to make a donation to the Bookshop Barnies, it's the only funding that we get. Price of a coffee, I think it's about £10 in London now. Price of a cup of coffee would be grand. Anyway, look, it's a very important discussion as it happens about architecture, about its importance, about its overindulgence sometimes. Ever since the pyramids, architects have been building up to a point. Architects know what it's like to be insulted. Some have been called the N word, engineer. But few people really understand the profession and really what we get up to. It's not helped by the fact that architects have a language all to themselves. Fortunately, this book doesn't really do that. It's very readable, very engaging, and thoroughly critical of the profession and what architects do and more. Reinier de Graaf himself is a Dutch architect, architectural theorist, partner at OMA, Office for Metropolitan Architecture. He's the co-founder of OMA's think tank AMO, and he's led projects in Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. He's taught at many institutions across the world. He's written a novel. He's written several books of nonfiction, and architects say that they're overworked. One of the points in the book, funnily enough, is that Reinier says that architects should pack it in at 67 years old. And given that Reinier, I was going to say your boss, but Rem Koolhaas is 79. Reinier,
he's 80. He's turning 82 pretty soon.
Oh, blimey! Well, there you go. Yeah. Time just goes very fast when you get to that age, doesn't it? But Rainier's only
I'm turning 60. I'm turning 62 in 2 weeks, by the way.
Well, happy birthday to you. Yeah. But I'm just wondering whether there's a subtle takeover bid in the actual conversation. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The joke's lost now, Reinier. But anyway, we're very grateful that you're with us tonight. Thank you very much indeed. It's a terrific book. I really, really recommend it. If you haven't already read it or bought it, then get a copy. In this session, we'll explore some of the arguments about the future of the industry. And there'll be plenty of time to ask questions. So the way the Barney works is I'll ask Reinier to speak for just 5 minutes or so, just to raise his introductions and give us a brief overview. I'll raise maybe 4 or 5 questions after that, just to give him a chance to have more bites of the cherry and for you to get a clear understanding about his arguments. And then it's out to you for questions and comments. Criticism is okay as well, I presume. So look, I know you're all muted, but if you can just unmute for a very brief moment, just to give a round of applause. Reinier, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. So I'll introduce the book. This is the 4th book I wrote, the 3rd nonfiction book, and it's in a way part of a sequence in my view. I generally, my books have either no illustrations or very few illustrations, and that is for a reason, is that I like to write about the work of architects, and therefore I don't write about works of architecture. I think there is an immense amount of books for sale everywhere, very illustrated, always sort of rather triumphalist books by architects about their own work, singing their own praise, or other people, or their friends singing their praise, etc., etc. I thought there was enough of those, but I think there are very, very few people actually candid about the nature of our work. Maybe that is for very good reasons, because I think if you're overly candid, it may not necessarily be good for business, but that hasn't happened yet, although with the very first book, I was extremely nervous about that. My first book is about, let's say, misconceptions of architects about the world, about the relative insularity of architecture, and it tries to contextualize architecture as a pun in a much larger force field. The other book, Architect Verb, is actually the opposite direction. It's about misconceptions of the world about architecture. The book is a dictionary with with a glossary of terms which are projected upon architecture rather aggressively, very often viciously virtuous, I would say, but therefore, in my view, also highly suspicious. That book is called Architect Verb, and the original subtitle, which the American side of Verso actually axed was the ultimate guide to world-class, award-winning, innovative, creative, sustainable, beautiful buildings that foster a sense of place and well-being. So in a single sentence, all the tick boxes you have to tick these days to be a good architect, and more than that, prove yourself a good person. But if you put them in a single sentence, they are obviously over the top, ridiculous, etc., etc. So that was that book. Then there was quite a while nothing, and then particularly many of my colleagues started to approach me with the question, like, yeah, you say it, you analyze it so clearly, you put into words what is wrong, but you don't tell us what to do about it. And what should we do? What should we do? Very, very irritating questions because, frankly, I wrote this book, but I have no clue. Um, but I decided to take the challenge, and I feel very, I must say, this book, maybe the last book, is quite aggressive in parts, but I always feel very reticent to be propositional. I think, some of the best writing uh, is not propositional. I think there is a frictional relationship. So initially, this book started under the title Elephants in the Room. I had made a list of subjects which make architects uncomfortable, subjects that are out there, and that if we don't address them, they will get the better of our industry. Then I went back and forth with my editor, with the publisher, as you do, and the idea of a manifesto as a format came. So I've written a novel, I've written a dictionary, and this was a manifesto. And it was the format I infiltrated to give direction to what otherwise was a fairly heterogeneous collection of uncomfortable subjects. Then the problem with the manifestos is that manifestos starts writing themselves because manifestos have to be not against, well, it's called architecture against architecture, but I must say somehow it's a passionate plea for architecture. I love architecture. I love our field. I love our profession. I always have to repeat that to people who, after reading my books, don't believe me, but I do passionately. I wrote the book partly because I think if we're not careful and if we continue our insular manner, uh, there's a fair chance that in 20 years' time, our profession will not exist anymore. And I wouldn't like to see that happen. So it is, in a way, a call for our profession to grow up in many ways. I think architecture is being eroded from two sides. First, by people who don't understand architecture to tell architects what architecture is about. There's a fair bit of those, but there is also a subtle erosion happening from within, from architects who suffer from the romantic notion, from the tradition of the gentleman amateur aesthete who does this as a hobby. The notions, as soon as you start about labor unions in the context of architects' practices, they're not for it, they're not against it, but they just look at you like, what? But surely that's not for our kind of people. Labor rights, we're above that because we love what we do. And I think that's in some way very dangerous. I think, there is an element of art, I think, in architecture if you do it well, but to brand yourself as an artist and therefore exempt from, much of the emancipatory tendencies of the 20th century is very, very, very dangerous. So I wrote a book and I said, what if we regard architecture as an industry like any other? What if we hold it accountable to the same things, the same workers' rights, labor unions, ownership, advancement of technology, etc.? How do we educate ourselves? So I decided to look at all of that and then really, what happens if you unleash uh, a Marxist analysis, if you wish, on architecture, or what if even if you unleash a normal labor, an analysis of labor relations on architecture. And in that sense, to do that properly, I had to declare myself in favor of all of the things I raise in the book. I mean, there is a point, I think, in my career where I actually might have benefited from a labor union. I don't think that's the case anymore, but that doesn't mean you should necessarily dismiss them. I mean, I've made the normal career progression from a rebellious employee to a ruthless employer. But I mean, I've known both sides in a way. So that's the book. There's two parts. Architects, that's essentially about the things I just spoke about. And then there is the second book, Architecture, which is an attempt to, in a way, align our preoccupation a little bit more to the real urgencies of the world and to stare those urgencies in the face properly and earnestly. I hate the term sustainability. That was already evident in my previous book. There's another chapter in here that says, forget sustainability. Not that I'm, of course, against sustainability. I mean, all of the terms that are projected on architecture are so viciously good that you can't have a discussion about them. The moment you are against well-being, happiness, sustainability, you're a sort of Patrick Schumacher. Uh, a highly suspicious individual, but I think the problem is the one-dimensional nature of these terms that they often turn as a fig leaf for token action, not real action, etc., etc., etc. So it's in a way a kind of a criticism of woke terms, not from a right-wing perspective, but from a properly old-fashioned left-wing uh, uh, perspective, hence the color of the book. Well,
Very good.
that's in excess of 5 minutes, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was very enjoyable. So I let you crack on. It was very, very good. Thoroughly engaging, as is the book. You that mix of kind of challenging ideas, humor. It comes across very well. So look, let me just ask you a couple of questions on this. Just on the first one, since you say the sections are divided between architects and architecture, two halves of the book in some respects, I thought it was reflecting a little bit that it was the importance of building rather than the authors of the buildings, which in that part of the book is what you were talking about. The example you use in the first chapter about not venerating architects per se is David Adjaye. For those people who don't really know, David Adjaye is probably the only top leading black architect in the UK, possibly, number one in the world in some respects. The fact about his problem was that he was destroyed by cancel culture. His mistake was the fact that he was the only black architect, the face of EDI. And then overnight, he was publicly shamed and ostracized. It was a witch hunt in some respects. So I simply thought it was a very odd choice of yours to use him. I mean, I remember I wanted to write an article in defense of David Adjaye. So why did you use him as the exemplar?
Well, my article is both in defense of David Adjaye and in attack of the phenomenon of the overly venerated star architect. I think I say it very clearly. I don't know what he did or, according to him, didn't do, nor do I care. I thought it was illustrative. I mean, he was simply the most extreme example of somebody who was elevated to a level that no human being can conform to. He was elevated to near deity, personification of goodness, of emancipation, racial, gender, and the emancipation of an entirely disprivileged continent, etc. It's just a little too good to be true. So, and I think the fall of David Adjaye is directly related to the unrealistic level with which he was placed on a pedestal. And I think he shouldn't have been cancelled, but I don't think he should have been placed on the same pedestal. I think, and this is very, very personal, I think David Adjaye is a reasonable architect. If I think away what he represents and what you ought to think of him, I think that away. I think on the spectrum of top architects, he is so-so. In all fairness. So, and he was largely also elevated, I think, more because of what he represented than his brilliant work. I think that's simply the case. And it's that issue that I take issue with. And I could have taken Richard Meyer, but that was too long ago and simply also less extreme. I think it is, it is probably the same wishful thinking and the same people doing the wishful thinking that put him up and take him down. And I think that's the irony. And it proves, I mean, there's about 100 people who lost their job as a result of that. Many commissions he lost, people out of work. They have to find new work. There's simply far more at stake than the reputation of the founder alone. And if we make our industry, and it's very tempting. I mean, I work in circumstances where for the longest we have used the reputation of our founder, to get work, to get promoted, etc. I'm deeply privy of the vulnerability of that phenomenon and also of of its finality over time. Because if people aren't cancelled, they die eventually. And what then? And the nature of an industry is that you have a cause, you have a business, which you need to continue. Mortals die, businesses hopefully do not die when the mortals die. And I think we open ourselves up to, yeah, to a level of vulnerability that worries me.
I just wanted to move on to the question about, since you mentioned it, about unionization, which
Mm.
again features quite strongly in your write-up. I used to be the shop steward in the MSF union, as it happens, in the
Yeah,
1990s. So it's not that hard to join a union if you want to,
yeah,
especially in the UK. They've liberalized quite a lot. But it was more the fact that even though unions have their place, and I exactly take what you're trying to say, but they aren't what they used to be, are they? This
yeah,
is part of the stick in your book. As a matter of fact, union membership is falling. They're disaffiliating, especially in
yeah.
the UK. But also, many union leaders are reporting their own members for wrong think and microaggressions, all those things that you've just talked about. So, are you being a bit romantic about what a union is, or
I'm deeply romantic. Yeah, that's one of the things I'm deeply romantic about. I know all of that, and people have also said this to me. And in discussing, obviously, the book that has come up, but I am deeply romantic about it. My uncle was a union leader in the port of Rotterdam. I think he features in the book, and not unsuccessful in terms of. Making significant gains in terms of cutting working hours and pay. So when I think of unions, I think of that. But I mean, the broader issue is that uh, the broader issue is the relationships as you see them in many architectural firms, and to some extent, probably even our own here, is that there is that the love for the work in a way makes people blindsided to the abuse that can follow because of the love of the world at work. And I think what is very strange is that the love of the work from employees that employers take advantage of is the same advantage that clients in turn take of those employers. So, and I think, we have to kind of we can't pay people too much, otherwise we can't do our job, otherwise we can't do great buildings, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's the wrong logic. I think, once you can also prove to clients that you have to pay people, you manage expectations on the part of clients that you might actually fundamentally change the conditions under which you work, including the financial conditions. And so it's about reverting that logic. One of the things I think architects suffer from is a certain amount of internal competitions. A common trait amongst architects is to think that they are all the best and they're so much better than all the other ones that they shouldn't even compete with them, et cetera, et cetera. But they are incredibly insular. I've on a number of major jobs with multiple architects involved, I've tried to sort of talk to other architects to collectively enforce conditions upon clients, even when we were in competition with each other. I mean, that's one of the most dispiriting experiences in my life. You get the so and so of a famous French architect on the phone. It's no, no, but we don't want to upset the client. No, no. You get it. The sort of the star architects can be incredibly weaselly when push comes to shove. So but it's about that. It's the simple. If the world in the 19th century would have had the same disposition to child labor as architects have to unions, we would still be having child labor. And it's about a mind shift. I'm sure that, people have asked me, do you in Oma want to start a union? But I'm an employer, so Of course not, because any union I would start would be meaningless. A union is something that happens to you as an employer, and then your legacy is how you deal with it, not whether you start it or it's how you deal with it when it presents itself, how well you are able to make the economic case to show that certain demands are reasonable, other demands may not be reasonable, but that conversation doesn't happen at all. So the part about union is, in a way, an instrument to foster a more honest conversation between, we all call ourselves architects. Nevertheless, some of us are on the payroll, some others are self-employed, and some of us are bosses. But we all call ourselves architects, and that somehow sometimes obscures the class struggle that, is also actively present in our job, just as in any other industry. So my
Okay.
book is mainly a manifesto for the normal.
That's a good starting point. That's a very old-fashioned way of looking at things. But anyway, look, I'm flitting about because you've got many chapters of different topics here. But in chapter 13, you start off by talking about overcoming natural barriers, because you do that example of the terrible tidal flood that occurred in 64, which came down the east coast of England as well as in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Thousands of people killed, and so you start by talking about overcoming natural barriers, and you finish the chapter by talking about adapting to nature. So you describe this kind of fantastically impressive flood defense system that was built not only in Europe but in the UK as a response to that kind of flood. But then you conclude as an appeal to a well-negotiated surrender to
Yeah,
nature. Yeah,
it's
I just
they're
wonder. I
both.
wonder what happened to yourself there.
Nothing happened to me. I actually describe two approaches of the Netherlands with something like 70 years in between.
Hmm.
I describe it as a carefully calculated surrender, but it's actually what is happening. We still have, it's kind of, we are the country that is the result of geoengineering. I mean, par excellence, 65% of our territory is below sea level. When we built all the dikes, when we built the delta works in Zeeland, it was in a time when we had moderate climate anomalies. They occurred every now and then. Nevertheless, we wanted to be safe. That could never happen again, and we built all of those flood systems. Now, that was before climate change. And my country is facing a very interesting dilemma, is that with rising sea levels, supposedly we have these announcements by the Queen and then later by the King, like we're finally secure. Our flood defenses are finished. They keep saying that, but then, there's more. They're never finished. This is a constant fight. I mean, our country is being pumped on a daily basis. There is energy being consumed, et cetera, et cetera. The amount of money that goes into keeping the flood defenses up to speed with rising sea climate change, et cetera, is going through the roof. And there's going to be a tipping point, I think, at some point where the costs might be prohibitive. That is being recognized. So what is happening is that with the retreat of agriculture as we face it, so the water is given a kind of freeway in part of the country in order to save other parts of the countries. Now, in my view, that is simply a more sophisticated form of geoengineering, which doesn't naturally assume humans' superiority over nature, but simply regards ourselves as part of nature that we can manipulate, that we can steer, but that we cannot keep at bay. I mean, the whole point of the chapter, is that there may not be such a thing as nature and non-nature, that even climate change is nature, because if man is part of nature, then the processes man unleashes are also part of nature. So it's about an increasing complexity of that relationship. But the chapter is bracketed by two prevailing approaches to fighting or living with the water in the Netherlands, with 70 years between.
Yeah, no, look, I quite enjoyed your argument. I thought it was a clever argument about saying if humanity is part of nature, then man-made global warming is a natural event in some respects. So that is kind of, I don't know. I think I was going to say double speak, but I think it's kind of quite an interesting way of looking at it, and it kind of knocks a few environmentalists back on their heels when they hear it. But I was thinking that since you've already announced yourself as a Marxist, that that idea about man having superiority over nature was fundamental to a Marxist approach to the way that we see ourselves. So
Yeah, and that's quite interesting because Verso is a Marxist publisher, and one of the uh, it's quite interesting that Marx has a number of unpublished works that he written after Das Kapital, etc., 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 where a certain amount of environmentalism or ecology or whatever you want to call it factored into some of his theories. It was Engels who didn't want them published because it was an unwelcome distraction in the context of class struggle. But I mean, there are those who say that Marxist theories, when you extrapolate them, um, which are about resources, which are about a fair division of resources, are considerably more subtle about the environmental question than often thought. And anyway, even if that part of my arguments is at odds with Marx, I also don't care because I mean I'm not religious in that sense. I think that Marx's works is just fretted over for interpretation just as much as the Bible. And I think the story about climate change is also very evangelical, often, an evangelical plot with suffering and potential redemption at the end. I think we're entering a period where climate change is exactly what it professes to be, change all the time, everywhere. No a loss of a certain amount of predictability that was inherent to seasons. I think we're fundamentally and have already entered an altered state. Even climate change is not something. Every climate conference starts with the frank admission that the goals of the previous conference aren't met. But the goals of this one will be met. And I think we are already, if we're honest about it, at a point where we will have to start thinking of how we coexist with it rather than build everything in wood, have no carbon emissions, and live happily ever after at all. I mean, I don't believe that.
no, that's fair enough. I think and obviously the biblical side of things is that man has dominion over nature, and but I do think that Marx was very clear that a lot of the later notes that many of those environmental Marxist books relate to are not playing fair with what Marx actually wrote. But that's another conversation for another day,
Yeah.
Reinier. But look, there's lots to talk about. But I think if I just come to you with a last point, really, on AI, the ubiquitous dangers, worries, wonders of AI. You see AI taking over the role of creativity. And that's true, isn't it? Because when AI first started, everybody thought it was going to be the menial tasks that would be done because architects and judges and lawyers have judgment and robots can't do that. Whereas now we're finding out that that's exactly what they can do. But you say that the world turns with or without an architect. Already more than 90% of buildings are produced without an architect being involved. So,
Mhm.
what is the point of an architect, would you say?
So can I get back to the notion of menial tasks and creativity?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I see creativity, or what many people deem creativity, in fact, as a menial task.
Hmm, hmm.
That I think is another conception about architecture is about, I mean, I don't know what AI will do. I don't think anybody really does. But I mean, since there is such a massive lament and almost apocalyptic worry about AI, I decided to sort of really see the bright side. And what I hate about my job is that, you have ideas at a certain point, they're good, they're bright, they're brilliant, etc., etc. And then something takes physical shape and you're confronted with an endless regime of choices and decisions where I don't really care. I mean, yes, I like maybe travertine more than onyx. I might like blue better than yellow, but they're fundamentally arbitrary decisions, and nevertheless, they are the decisions that take most of your time, have the longest, most futile discussions with clients. So I thought if the issue of style, if the issue of taste could be surrendered to AI, then maybe what we do can become more conceptual. Maybe we can penetrate the core philosophy of what architecture really is. Maybe we can get closer to the true meaning of architecture if we're not constantly distracted by, things that have to do with taste. And we can argue till we're blue in the face, but ultimately our arguments are no more convincing than those who are supposedly not architects. So in that sense, I think I write somewhere, we have to select kitchen sinks, types of furniture. The fun has started and it's no fun. So
No schedules.
yeah,
Can't beat it.
it is about uh, that. We use AI already quite a lot because I think I use it on many fronts, simply driven by a real curiosity about what it can do, not necessarily to make my job easier, but because I'm interested in the mental effects of AI on what we think about when we think about architecture, what we think fundamentally the discipline uh, is. That's it. But what was the question? I mean, I digressed, I think.
You digress quite reasonably. No,
Yeah.
I was simply asking what is the role of an architect. You probably have covered it in some respects, but if you want to give us a final punch, that's fine.
I think, yeah, so it's, I do believe that, I mean, nobody needs an architect to get a building. I think that's fundamentally true.
Mhm.
But I think the comparison I make, and I've no idea if it's fair, but I think it's compelling. Let's say all literature is books, but not all books are literature, crudely saying.
Mhm.
So um, let's say in a conservative definition, all buildings are architecture is buildings, but not all buildings are architecture. I think what an architect delivers is consciousness. Philip Roth once said about literature, literature doesn't invent fact, in fact, it invents consciousness. And I think that is very, very similar for an architect. Nobody needs an architect to build a building, but I would like to think that you get a different type of building and a better thought out building when an architect is involved. And I think that a lot of the things that there is a lot of emphasis on these days, sustainability, the economy of means, not being wasteful, etc., that they are already in a way embedded in the consciousness of architecture. If you look at all good architecture from the past, that in one way or another, it was always doing that, translating the zeitgeist or the methods of production or the way of thinking of any given time in the most meaningful physical way possible. And I think that is what architecture does. And I think architecture will therefore also survive as a form of consciousness, provided it is aware of that. And the more undue claims you make on things that you really cannot live up to, the more you risk what is at the core of your discipline. And in that sense, I hate architects who sort of roll over each other to say that they're the most sustainable, livable, who copy this outside rhetoric in a kind of breathless condition just to keep up. I think that is, it's a desperate attempt to remain with the time and the best guarantee to not be off the time anymore, that disposition.
Well, it wins you contracts, it wins you grant funding. So maybe they are of their moment. But look,
Yeah, but I mean, the more we comply, the more that becomes a
of
reality,
course,
I
of
think.
course, of course, of course,
I
self-fulfilling
think, yeah,
prophecy.
yeah.
Exactly. Look, can I? Sorry to everyone. I'm going to ask you. Can I ask you one more question? And that was a good hiatus point. I should stop there, but I just want to go back to the environmental conversation. Since you're now saying that the be all and end all of architecture is not the environment, I take from that. Um, but you do say you want demolition to become taboo because the environmental impact is catastrophic. And it reminded me that I was at a meeting a year ago or so when I heard the head of the 20th Century Society, which is a
Yeah, yeah. I know.
conservation area.
Yeah.
She was arguing for conservation because it would avoid carbon emissions.
I mean,
Uh,
I use that argument, but it's not the main argument. I conveniently use that argument because it adds fodder to my demolition moratorium. It works the other way. The chapter before that
Hmm.
calls on architects to temporarily stop building.
Yes.
Very
Yes.
stupid thing to say for an architect.
Yeah.
Unbelievably stupid. But
But you said it.
I said it, and I also think it because I think by, particularly in relation to the housing crisis, if I look at my own country, uh, we supposedly have this massive housing crisis. You know, there's a whole generation of young people with perfectly respectable jobs, middle class jobs that cannot get a mortgage, cannot get a home. There's a real availability and affordability problem. If you divide the amount of residential substance in the Netherlands by the population, you have 55 square meters per person. That's well in excess of the existence minimum. In fact, if you have a family with 2 children, you can get 220 square meters, which is a villa somewhere in Blaricum. Blaricum is the kind of uh, well, whatever. It's big.
Gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
It's posh, and that is, and I know people own it. People own residential buildings without living in them. Foreign investors are buying large amounts of residential matter, leaving them empty. There is, single people's households living in family homes, and there's in a way there's an unfair division of the substance. The substance is therefore artificially scarce, therefore too expensive. So I argued for a building moratorium in a way to expose those conditions, to force a kind of catharsis, and maybe to refuse buildings until the conditions have fundamentally changed. If we keep on building, we never have we never shed any light on that problem. We don't talk about it. We allow existing injustices to continue by building. And any building in the Western world these days is supposedly space for people. More importantly, it is actually a financial means to create return on investment. I mean, construction is the closest thing England has to a national industry. Any Western country faces today, with production having moved away to places like India, China, etc., we inflate our GDP primarily by inflating the value of all our real estate. Now, that means we get rich on paper as nations, but that the average person finds it harder and harder and harder to find an affordable home. We find the percentage of our income that we have to spend on living permanently on the increase. So we subsidize our own GDP by ever more miserable living conditions. And so therefore, what a building stop hopes to achieve is to bring that to such a level of crisis that people will spontaneously resolve that we will have to recalibrate value to use value. And in the meantime, of course, if you don't build, you have to use every square meter of existing substance. You can also not have preservation policies because you have to preserve simply everything. That is the main argument. So also UNESCO, you can just kill it. But that is the crux of that argument. And then the fact that demolition also contributed a lot of carbon emission was a very convenient paragraph to add. I mean, even one that my publisher advertised I would kill, but I kept it in.
Very good, very good. You know where your audience is, Reinier. No, I think you make a good point. I think that the housing issue, obviously, I mean, at one point in your book, you say that people who say that the houses that are being built in the wrong place is a fallacious argument. I don't necessarily hold with that, but I do think what you say at the very end of the book. I was just going to quote up here. You say. Each and every recommendation in the book can be dismissed as impossible to implement, but that each might provoke conscientious activism. So, on the basis of it being a manifesto, food for thought, rocking the boat, and making people think, I think you've done a very valuable job. So, thank you for that. So, look, let me take some questions. So, we have Alex, if you would.
Hi there. Really valuable contribution so far for sure. Just to paraphrase, if I might, Gordon Gecko, demolition is good. You say that without asking for a ban on building, we can't have that conversation, which I don't think is the case. I think there's one of the problems. By the way, I'm a painter and decorator, Rainer. Some people call it graphic design. Um, so I come to architect for kind of that direction. I've got a real interest in it, but I'm not an architect. But I do recognise a lot of the conversations in architecture that are happening in graphic design as well. AI, I think, is an interesting one, and I think the problem with the conversation today, anyway, is it's posed as it's either this or it's that,
Mhm.
and it's much more important than that. And we were told, remember, that the desktop revolution was going to change things, so much so that the menial stuff that designers spent all their time on
Mm.
would disappear, and it would leave us to crack on with the real creative work. That never happened. Something else happened. But it wasn't because of the technology. It was the culture that surrounded the discipline that kind of pushed us in that direction. And that's, I think, also the case today for AI. It's the culture around it that is going to influence the importance or not of AI in terms of the creative process. So just your thoughts on that would be really useful.
Thank you very much. Reinier, if I can take a couple of questions, if that's all right, would you mind?
No,
Uh,
no.
and while I was going to, at the very early start of this conversation, I was going to thank you and congratulate you for having such brilliant English, grasp of English. We then have Alex with his wonderful Scottish accent. So
Yeah,
hopefully you caught that.
yeah,
Yeah, good. Okay. Now we have Annan. Annan was a
It's
great.
only you that doesn't understand me.
yeah.
The audience is revolting. That's a
Yeah.
Marxist kicking off. Annan, where have you gone? Are you
Hi.
there? Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. I have two questions. One is about probably when we talk about architects, is there maybe a need to differentiate the young architects and those senior, and obviously there are also architectural assistants, because I feel like in scenarios, especially the big corporates, like the young architects, they are architects, but they are not on the same level as in terms of agency, like in terms of the design agency. And also in terms, it's kind of inevitable because in dealing with such a gigantic project, there are people who inevitably need to do this mundane practices that's probably not design work. But also when this kind of architects sort of leave the big corporates and start their own practice, they will also sort of have to yield other people agency to achieve their own sort of design desire. I'm just wondering, is there maybe like a way out of this? Like, what's the ideal way? Because if we talk about architects for us all, what's the ideal way of sort of equalizing everyone's agency? And my second question is about your sort of proposition between the boundary between architectural practice and architectural academia. Because I'm such like a fan of all my professors who also had practice, because it's really like impossible for you to have, for anyone to have like two careers side by side. And again, this kind of career choice is also quite rare in terms of the percentage in the architecture industry. And if, as you said, there has to be sort of end of distinction between theory and practice, how can we sort of actualize that
Oh,
just in terms of time? Yeah.
Yeah.
okay. Thanks. Look, I'll come back to you, Rainier. Do you want to tackle those two, and I'll come back to the hands in a
Yeah,
moment.
I would like to start with the last
Sure.
one. You said a couple of things, and I think clearly there is a difference between established architects and architects who start out. I prefer starting to establish than young and old, because I mean we're all going to live forever if the 21st century promises what it needs to be. So that distinction will fade. But let's say at the start of a career or with an established career, let's say when you lift off or when you're at cruising altitude. So let's use that metaphor. many established architects were once starting architects, and rather than comparing yourself at this moment in time to somebody who's established and is starting, I think it is important that we compare the two types of starts to each other, that we make a comparison, for instance, like um, how difficult, in terms of insurance premiums, a day and age where everything is financialized to such an extreme that the risk of a starting architect and the amount of insurance premiums you pay for that becomes such that it becomes prohibitive of starting the way this office started, for instance, or the way something like MVRDV or any Dutch practice started in the early 90s, when there was an active, at least in the Netherlands, an active government policy to support starting practices and a certain well, I guess insurance companies who weren't as awake as they are in this day. And it's almost like how easy was it to buy a house in the 1980s? How hard has it become for somebody who was a dentist to buy a house? It's similar that there is, as we get wealthier, as the stakes, particularly the financial stakes, are risen, starting out becomes more difficult. Therefore, any necessary rejuvenation of the system becomes a very fundamentally different question. It almost has to happen from within architecture practices, because starting out it's a lot harder, I think. I mean, and we have the research and the numbers. One of my partners has our financial director has a very interesting lecture on it. It's online. I recommend you watch it. So there is that. Then I want to talk about the separation between practice and academia, and I really have to say this. I'm presently trying to start a program somewhere that, in a way, tries to put in practice some of the things I wrote about in chapter 7, the complete alienation from the two worlds from each other, from a context in academia where you have people studying esoteric subjects, then doing a PhD in esoteric subjects, then becoming a professor in esoteric subjects, teaching other people in esoteric subjects, and they have never seen a day of practice. They have never been yelled at by a client. They have never negotiated anything over £70, 50, no fees. They have never had to fight off a bankruptcy. And those are the people that actually have to decide whether or not you are fit to teach in the place. Those are the people that actually tumble over each other to tell you what practice is like. I think academia is fucked to an unbelievable degree, incapable of any introspection, incapable of any kind of honesty, and so estranged from reality that they have formed their own reality, and reality doesn't even function as a reality check anymore. You even have to convince them that there is such a thing as a gap between theory and practice. I find it a truly surreal experience. I won't go into the detail of where and how this is happening at the moment, but it's a very, very worrying thing, and I needed to get that off my chest. Then about the building stop, in order to stop demolition. I think the two are unrelated, but I advocated for the building stop in a very radical way to put a radical end to demolition, and the two are wed. And this is the style of a manifesto, is that you embark on a subject and you drive it to an extreme, and then it triggers other extremes. I mean, at many points in writing the book, esoteric academia, most importantly, keeps academics from. Oh, the chat went away. I was
It's there, the chat is. It's there in the chat.
trying to read the chat. I mean,
Esoteric academia, most importantly, keeps academics from doing actual damage in the real world.
that's also that's a very interesting way of seeing it in that sense. Maybe things are good the way they are. The nature at many points in writing this book, I felt uncomfortable with the direction it took. But it's like, once elephants in the room starts marching in the same direction and they become a herd, they become scary. And at times my own writing scared me because I ended up advocating things well beyond my comfort zone, but they made sense in the context of the book. They made sense in the context of reasoning. And I think if you theorize things, good theories tend to do that with you, just as good design ideas. Whenever you have a really good design idea, there's always this quintessential moment that you do not know whether you've stumbled upon something utterly profound or whether you've just gone utterly mad. I think the most important ideas have that. So that was anyway. The jury, what kind of book this is of course out. And on AI, all revolutions take place and don't take place. The computer didn't create the paperless office. The computer didn't create the leisure revolution. It quite the opposite. The computer probably generated longer working hours than ever. And there is always a change that is brought, but then we presume that something else is no longer necessary, but that carries on existing as well. So the history is always incredibly messy, and I think there is much AI, it's very early days. There's all kinds of extreme extrapolations about AI. I think the reality is that the future will be as much of a messy hybrid as the past was when it comes to technological revolution.
Yeah, that's a good hiatus point. Good rhetorical flourish. Thank you very much, Reinier. Okay, we have there's three hands. It includes Richard Wolf and Patrick Schumacher. So can I take two of you, if that's all right? Do you mind hanging on fire, Patrick, for a while? Sheila first.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Really fascinating. I live and work in Manchester in the United Kingdom, the first ever industrial city, the home of the original slums. I commission architects for really small things and some medium-sized things, but I have to say I love demolition, like Alex. I feel from my experience living and working in this city that we must start again. I just wonder about the experience in the Netherlands. I have to say, in practice, we're so many of us are sent on field trips to the Netherlands. I always find it fascinating. I end up in the Netherlands looking at really beautiful little streets and houses, and come back to Manchester and go, we can't do that. We can't do that here for a number of reasons. The Netherlands was demolished in World War II, was it not? We still have.
Very small part of it.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
know.
the Germans did a good job, but in
Yeah.
very particular places.
I know, I understand, but we still have terrible Victorian conditions in Manchester. Sorry, it's such a cliche. Also, we are not flat. So I know what the benefits of an architect are, but this is the problem for us as on the client side and the public and the government side. The problem is that not all architects are the same. This might be really obvious to you. You know what's good, you know who's rubbish. But to have as many years ago when we had this renaissance of architecture in the UK, you know, the Commission for the Built Environment produced a guidebook for how to appoint architects. And the first sentence of the book was, to have a good design, you have to appoint a good designer. Okay, that sounds like really easy, doesn't it? But not all of them are the same. And this is the question. So as a client, when you work with a poor architect, by whatever measure, it is utterly soul destroying. So I suppose my question into this discussion is, who decides what is a good architect? The user of a building, the commissioner of a building, the funder of a building, other academics, other architects? And I really felt some pain in the complete alienation between practice and academia, because I stepped briefly into academia and I was like, oh my God, I don't know what they're talking about. And I have to say that I prefer the cut and thrust of the real world, you know, like, where are we going to put this building and how do we build it with real money right now? So my question is, who really decides what is a good architect in any age, at any point in history? Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, Reinier, do you want to take that? And I'll take, if that's all right, Richard.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because I mean I think we have had a situation for a very, very long time where, like in many professions, it is often peers who judge each other, and then but peers is an isolated group, and architects among architects can form a majority opinion, but that's still only the opinion of architects, who are a minority, when it comes to the population at large. I think a couple of things. It's of course completely logical to say it's the users of buildings and people who actually have to suffer the consequences of architecture who should have a say. It's very, very logical. There a number of things have happened which have problematized that in my view. First of all, I think there are many people who speak on behalf of the masses, on behalf of, I mean, just as modern architects spoke on behalf of the masses, supposedly in possession of privileged knowledge what the masses wanted, the modern property developer also speaks on behalf of the consumers. It's very interesting that the word user is absent in both masses and consumers. They are both amorphous heaps, and the more amorphous and unknown the group of users, the more emphatically the wishes that are quoted on their behalf. So I think there is a lot of ruis, I don't know the English word for that. There is a lot of fuzz and unclarity there. I think, and that's one of the points I make in the book. I mean, by the way, whenever people regard the Netherlands as a kind of nirvana, very quickly after, then I'm very proud, but then very shortly thereafter they mention Denmark, and then I'm considerably less happy. But I don't know. I mean, it's. I'll take it for what it's worth. And yes, we are flat. And yes, we have a somewhat more relaxed, less traumatic relation to modernity. I've lived in England for a very long time, so I feel completely comfortable to generalize. That there is all of that, but it's also not an ideal world either. I think what might be interesting is a reconnection to the user by architects, if only to shut out all the people who are speaking on behalf of users and who also don't know users. The typical property developer, which is also a vast majority of our clients, they have loans to buy leases. I mean, they work with land they don't own, with money they don't have, for people they don't know. And that is the ultimate speculative, both financially and metaphor and literally domain there exists. So there is a lot of, it's very interesting that, I grew up in a modernist housing estate, prefabricated, Plattenbau, hardcore Plattenbau, the same manufacturer, I think, that supplied things to East Berlin. I never took issue with my environment. There was a lot of grass, so we learned to play football very, very decently. I never took issue with the style. I always felt very sorry for people who had to live in inner city conditions, which are now celebrated by the next generation as the most posh, gentrified things. I felt sorry for those people. So opinions are also volatile and manipulable, and a product of mass hypnosis, just as any other thing. And I think the only real way to shut that out is probably by somehow a liaison with users. I mean, I find it very interesting that often the greatest freedom we get is when we work with a client who is also the user of the building he asks us to do. There is more freedom in that than when you work with a speculative developer who is afraid of anything because the people, the consumers, may not like that, and they don't know. So the absence of user and spokespeople on behalf of absent users actually give you more of a straitjacket than actually people who use the building. So I think the value of architecture is probably the level of satisfaction on either side when once a job is done. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
It'll have to. I think
Oh,
it was a
okay.
very fulsome answer, Reinier. So yes,
Yes.
it will do. I mean, I do think that there is, the ideal of every individual will have their own architect, and therefore there'll be a one-to-one. Whereas obviously when it gets to, as you put it in your book, mass housing, or if you're talking about
Yeah, but there are
trans,
also initiatives there. There are Baugruppen in Germany. There are the Fido-Comices in South America, where actually the role of the architect is partly to coordinate groups of users who will be using buildings. So it's
I
not
know,
strictly,
but I
yeah.
know, but I'm old enough to remember it, Renier. So in my day, in the 1970s, when we were talking about user participation, we were talking about people who were going to be avoiding the state. They didn't want the social housing. They didn't want to be part of
Yeah,
state
yeah,
provision.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas,
yeah.
ironically, now all those people are being funded by the state. So the reflection of what they mean is a different concept. Like we talked about, left wing
True. Yeah,
discussions have changed now. Yes.
true.
Anyway,
Yeah.
okay, good, good, good. Richard, if you would please, and then Patrick.
Great. Well, I just want to say congratulations. My copy of RIBA Journal dropped through my door this morning,
Oh,
and you're in it.
am I in it?
You are certainly in it. I just wanted to share your.
Oh my
Oh,
God.
There you go. So I have to congratulate you on being one of the very few theorists that's ended up in the RIBA Journal. But my question on your manifesto, and I haven't read your book, but I have read your précis in RIBA Journal, is point 7. And you say that it's time for shock therapy.
Yes, yes, yes.
All right, here we go. Make construction labour a mandatory part of education for students to graduate or teachers to qualify. Now, my question is this. You're talking about theory and practice, but very little practice then engages with construction these days. That's the big division. So what is your manifesto, and where do you see the notion of architectural students physically building as being a
No, but
way
yeah,
forward?
yeah, yeah. That's
Give
not.
me, I'm very
Yeah,
interested in this.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, so I think first of all, architecture engages too little with construction. I think, of all the whole, if you look at the economy of building, we can have all sorts of opinion about contractors and anything, but let's say they earn an honest living because they make their living off labor. They make their living not off the sale and resale and resale and resale of real estate that accumulates value without any labor invested. So I think, and architects, I think, do the same. They work, that most of them work hard. So I think there's a sensible union of labor between architects and contractors, and that is the one thing. I don't think that the average pavilion that is being constructed outside the AA or the Bartlett actually has anything to do with that. I find that a rather decadent pastime of rich kids very often. The point is that this was clearly an analogy with Mao, who decided, and a very provocative one, who decided to re-educate the Chinese intelligentsia by learning them the value of honest labor on the land. So this is clearly a provocation of alienated academics, not necessarily that they learn how to build, but that they get a taste of the real world, that they leave the confines of their libraries, etc., etc., etc. And the reason that I say it's for students, because practical work for students, I did it. I mean, it existed in education. I think the main thing here is that I think the average academic should stand shoulder and shoulder with the laborers, tie up their steel-toe boots, wear their gilet jaune, wear their helmet, and slave away for a year, and then go back to doing whatever it is they were doing. But I think it's about breaking down the walls.
Metaphorically. Uh,
Well, maybe literally. But we said we wouldn't demolish, but
well, it's very funny because I actually had a question which I was going to apologize for maybe misrepresenting you as a Marxist, and then you've admitted it yourself. But it was very funny because I did think that what was it? Return to the fields or whatever the phrase was. I thought you were
flourish in the
flourish in the
fields. Yeah,
fields. Yes,
that's Mao. Yeah,
I thought I'd
yeah,
put the this is Kerry Brown's new book.
yeah.
I
Well,
did think,
that was inspiration for the cover of this book too.
Anyway, Patrick.
I have a few points. First of all, I want to say congratulations, Reinier. You're a star in China now with your notion that all architects over 70 should retire. it's been going through China like wildfire because they have all these kind of, 80 plus masters who are controlling the whole scene. And so I think you stirred something there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I know where you're coming from. I was on the left myself. You feel, you seem quite Puritan, left-leaning. There's a number of notions I want to pick up, but also, let's say, in terms of the class struggle, and in our industry, let's say, this idea of unions, and I just simply don't believe that, first of all, architects, as an employer, and employing architects, we take advantage of our employees, or just transmit that clients take advantage of us. I just trust the market forces, to sort that out. I mean, the number of people who going into architecture, has its charm, it has its kind of recognition, prestige. It's relatively easy. Studies you can fly through, you can, waffle your way through compared to the kind of hardcore STEM disciplines or kind of hardcore law degree or math, physics, etc., finance. So I think these things I trust are, playing out the way they should play out. It's demand and supply, and you can't just regulate that. Then you would have to have other processes. You would have to then ration, and that's why most monopolies, by the way, and that's something I've learned, are state reinforced. So you would have to go to the state and have the business protected, closed, and then you kind of make kind of cartelized prices. I don't believe in that. The one point. I want to have a few more points. I mean, one of the things, by the way, in terms of Sheila's question, who decides who is a good architect, what's a good architecture? I think we need to distinguish. I mean, ex ante, I mean, before the fact, I would have hoped, but as and trust that architects, that we have peer selection, that we understand and have the overview. And then if a developer or client looks for an architect, they can rely on peer selection and should ideally be able to trust the architect to translate their social functioning mature architect into what's best for them and for society, let's say. I think these low horizon has to do with the politicization of architecture, that we have actually too many of these lay people and the communities, inverted commas, kind of be allowed to prevent entrepreneurs, urban entrepreneurs, which are developers and architects, to generate and test the market, risk their skin, risk their money, and then let the end buyers, end users decide when they're in front of selections, not in advance, be scared, or prevent others to have houses next to them. So that's where I think we have the big problem, and that's where we have the, let's say, returns to investments. I have no problem with. The problem is, you quite rightly point to, is asset inflation, the housing crisis, supply crisis, which is actually a politically manufactured supply crisis, planning
Yes.
paralysis. That's where I'm coming from. And you say, okay, let's accelerate the housing crisis to stir kind of revolutionary transformation. I kind of like this as an old kind of, revolutionary, and I'm now kind of a new revolutionary. I want the libertarian revolution, and maybe, yes, stop demolishing, stop building. That's the kind of version of degrowth. I think there's a bit of a contradiction in your standing there, but I leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Okay, there's a lot there for you to chew over, Reinier. What do you think?
Yeah. I am less of a marketeer. I think that the market functions very well in certain sectors, in certain domains. I think there are also very clearly glitches in the way the market functions. And what I notice is that, once phenomena get of a certain scale, whether it's major infrastructure projects, whether it's defense contracts, but I also rank real estate and housing of this scale, that there the market has a problem because competition doesn't quite work the way it can work. I mean, if you don't like a car, there's tons of other cars that you can buy, and the car that nobody likes will go out of business. I think there is such a level of scarcity and sort of autonomized productions where users, you can wonder, do they like what they are getting or do they get what they like? I think once the scale eclipses a reasonable spectrum of competition, that the market does not function so well. For me, it is, I mean, I've witnessed too many empty housing developments, too many empty new ghost towns, where there was simply such an incredible mismatch between pricing and what people could afford, and exists on such a scale that I think you can definitely see that as that the market has derailed. I don't think, I mean, the market is like AI, most likely imperfect. The market is like any of the hybrid revolutions we spoke about. There is no such thing that delivers perfection, and I urge correction where it obviously doesn't work. I like to take, I mean, I could actually take the libertarian revolution, but I'm suitably uncomfortable with it because it's at odds with my upbringing. But I can see a fair point in its logic. I opted for a different kind of somewhat old-fashioned revolution, which is popular revolt. Once the value on paper, I think this is for me interesting, and this is maybe where I'm not a Marxist. If Marxist is predicated on class struggle, namely the revolt of an oppressed class against the ruling class, I think at a certain moment we are going to witness a very different dialectical opposition, and that is the opposition between abstract value and real value. We're going to get a crisis of value where the numbers on paper in no way reflect the sense of richesse on the ground, that we will all revolt against the market at some point, because simply on issues where it mattered, it generates such massive inequality. If you look at the fact that the success of capital is when the return on capital outpaces the return on labor. The Piketty argument. In other words, if you make more money by owning things, by having money, than you do by working for money, people can work all they want, they get relatively poorer. And I think what we're currently seeing with the Kushners and the Ivankas and etc. On a global scale, there is hereditary wealth will very quickly, when that happens, hereditary wealth will play a role that you're back to some form of patrimonial capitalism, which is not what capitalism was meant to create. But I think the system is in real danger of derailing, also because there are monopolies emerging, and because there is no proper competition, and because the accumulation of wealth also with new technologies is accelerated to such an extent, divorced from labor, that I think that there might be a revolt against the system rather than one class overthrowing the other class to be overthrown in turn. We're also, well, yeah. But I mean, this is well in excess of architecture.
I think it's where the book takes us, Reinier.
Yeah.
So it was a fascinating conversation. I mean, as it happens, I think that one of the earliest Bookshop Barneys we did was with Joel Kotkin in America, who's written quite widely about the new feudalism and the rise of the new clerisy. Slightly different, maybe, to your take, but I think it's a very interesting position. All the same, I also think that there's a wider conversation in some respects about developers as a landlord class, which maybe you're hinting at. I don't know whether I fully agree with that, even if I parodied what you actually said. I think the question about what makes a good architect or good architecture, it's kind of one of those unknowns. It's a bit like, you know it when you see it, a bit like works of art, but you have to be knowledgeable in the field in its own terms. But I do think that what's tended to happen now is that we're relying on spreadsheets, post-occupancy evaluation. Those people who are now creating a new industry of telling you what a good architecture is. As a matter of fact, I went to a conference recently which was talking about how sustainable architecture is good, and therefore good architecture is sustainable. So all you have to do is kind of use some rammed earth and some bamboo and some thatch, and you already.
But can I make an observation on that?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Because so the book I wrote before this one was architecture. It was the dictionary where I delved into 10 tick box terms, which we all know: sustainability, livability, inclusive innovation. And the nasty things, the vicious things about all those terms is that they are accompanied by excessive metric systems. They are measurable. And of course, when they are measurable, you can't argue with them. Anything that is measurable forces you to try and achieve the highest measure, even if you question the very category in which you have to excel. And I think this factorization through measurements, spreadsheets exist, for the most emotional things, we have spreadsheets. For the most intangible, like happiness is a spreadsheet at the moment. And I think that's a very, very a big source of creative unfreedom. And I think the more we think we can measure what good architecture is, the more remote will be from discovering what good architecture is. I think their measurement is really in the way of judgment.
Precisely, and the more we give over to the robot telling us what good architecture is, rather than our own humanity. But anyway, look, for me, we have to stop. It was a fabulous, great ambition within the book, great ambition within the conversation, very engaging on the battle of ideas. I think the book actually tackles things, which in many respects, and I think you say this in the book, it might seem ephemeral conversations, but it's as real as and important as a practical action. As a matter of fact, working out in advance what the ideological problems are is an important precursor to actually being able to change them on the ground. So for me, tremendous book. This is, as well as Reinier's other writings, which he's explained to you in some depth, a valuable and rare intervention into architectural discourse. So can we, again, unmute if you would, please, and just give Reinier a massive round of applause for an interesting, fascinating intervention in the discussion. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Austin.
Reinier, tremendous, mate. I'm very sorry for the interruption. I will edit it out. Have no fear.
Yeah, better.